Good evening and welcome to the India Development Debate. I'm Sumant Sinha. It's fairly clear now that there will be some sort of an extension of the lockdown post the 3rd of May. Today, when the chief ministers of various states met with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, some of them wanted an extension in the lockdown, some of them wanted some kind of easing, but at the end of the day, it will come down to perhaps 353 green zones in the country right now, which would lead the way to how life after COVID-19 would look. There is perhaps no government in the world which would sensibly take a risk of exposing its citizens even as the infection starts raging. So where do we really stand on the lives versus livelihood debate right now? We know a nearly 40-day of lockdown is hurting us economically. It's hurting people in terms of their livelihood, in terms of jobs. And some of these effects can go on for several years. So what's the way forward? To talk about this, I'm joined this evening by Arvind Virmani. He's chairman of the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare. I'm speaking with Nitin Pai, co-founder and director of Takshashila University. And I'm pleased to welcome Sumant Sinha, CMD of ReNew Power Ventures, to the show. Welcome to all of you. And thank you for speaking with us on the show today. Sumant, let me start by getting your take. Do you think, Mr. Sinha, that there is enough clarity for industry to actually start economic production? Because that needs to be the first sort of wheel that goes into motion. There was an attempt post 20th of April, largely didn't work. Do you think that now more clarity will come in? Is this plan of starting the economy in green zones viable in any way?
Look, I think, Tamanna, of course, thank you for inviting me to the show. This is a very complex question because there are many different strands of issues involved here. Of course, on the one hand, you want to save lives, and that itself is a very complex question in terms of whether we should, what is the nature of the lockdown that should continue. And then, of course, offsetting that is the issue of livelihoods, as you mentioned. Now, you've asked me the question about how will the livelihood piece part start. It's very difficult to start if only half the country is open, unfortunately, because the supply chains are all over the country. People have to come from different parts of India. All the laborers went back, for example. They have to start moving back. How will they move if they have to move through, let's say, red zones or containment zones? Will that be easily allowed or not? Or if they themselves happen to be in red zones, can they move out or not? And how do you restart something if, in fact, half your labor is there and the other half is not? Or your procurement or your supply chains are, or suppliers are sitting in areas which are themselves red zones and therefore not able to restart. As a factory or as a company or as a business, you can't make your product if even one component is not there. And so in some ways, it's very hard if some of your suppliers are sitting in parts of the country which are still shut down. And that's not a determination that you can make that easily. It will take time to make that assessment if you want to restart your business. But I think in general, and looking at it at a very macro sense, I think it is very important now for us to start finding ways of containing the infection wherever it is and starting to open up the rest of the country wherever it is possible. Some businesses, for the reasons I mentioned, may not be able to open up even in those green zones, but doesn't matter as long as other things can start opening up. And services can start opening up, shops can start opening up, small businesses can start opening up. I think all of that is very essential now because the economy has taken a very big hit. And I don't think that we can afford for the lockdown to continue any longer and for the economy to continue to go into a tailspin from this point on. Perhaps the point I'd like to make is that perhaps if there was some form or some way of giving some sort of a stimulus, maybe you could have carried on with this economic lockdown for a little bit longer. But in the absence of any kind of a stimulus or any kind of incentive, I think, if that is not to happen, then it is very essential for us to restart the business environment as well.
We're pretty much exactly 1 week away from where the second tranche of the lockdown is supposed to end. And there is no sign of this package that everyone has been talking about. I don't know if it's going to come. we seem to be looking at things as they go along. The RBI had to step in today because of the Franklin Templeton situation. But Mr. Virmani, my question is that can we really afford an extension of the lockdown? Now, the irony is that the situation is worse. The infections are the most in number in your most progressive and industrialized sort of areas. And those are the ones that just can't open.
So, we've been doing research on this at EGRO, and there's a way to think about it. But let me just start with 2 points. This issue is too often, if we are lazy, it's posed as lockdown versus no lockdown. That is not the issue. We are going to be in that intermediate stage, not just for the next 2 months, but probably for till the end of the financial year. So the question is, what is the intermediate step, which is which is the best way to go? Now, the way to think about this issue is there are basically this complexity is right. Mr. Sinha has given a sense of the complexity. The question is how do you deal with this complexity? And there are basically 3 dimensions of the issue which you have to address. One is the sectors, and basically what we have done is we have divided into 3 sectors for analytical purposes. One is, of course, the essential commodities, which is open already. Okay, and if there are problems in it, it's administrative and not clear instructions. So there is no restriction on essential commodities, and in principle, its supply chains are all supposed to be free. But the other 2 dimensions, so that is about 40% of the economy. Now the rest of it, 60%, is only 10% is what we are talking about even before the lockdown. What I call the contact sectors, where there is a lot of there's simultaneously a lot of people consuming the good. I mean, transport, retail, trade, etc. There are a lot of people around, right? So that is the question of transmission comes in there, right? So and then there's the rest of the economy. Now, the way to think of it is that rest of the economy can be freed up. That's the dimension. One dimension is that clearly that middle part is going to take a long time and be very slow. But the rest of the economy, with appropriate restrictions, like masks, proper toilets, etc., we can discuss that separately. The second dimension is really what you are discussing, what you started with. You can think of it as red and green zones or whatever. But the last I looked at it, I think about 1/3 to half of the districts in the country had no cases. Maybe now some of them have, let's say 1/3. So you could divide them into those which have a lot of cases and those which have less. But I think a third dimension is very important, which is density. We have been doing some research on what happened in the pandemic of 2019. And basically one of the papers suggested that at least in the UK, it went through the slums of that time, right? So density of population matters. As you know, 30% of India's metros and large cities have slums. Yes. So clearly in those metropolitan areas and slums, there's going to be an issue. But if you think of these 3 dimensions, I really don't see much of a problem in freeing up what I call the rest of the economy, which is 50% of it.
The thing is, you need
everywhere except the metros, and metros don't produce much goods. So I really don't see a big problem in phasing out. Finally, just very quickly, I want to mention the central legislation is under the Disaster Relief Act. The states can act, within that, and even if they want to exceed it in some way, they can go to the center and ask permission. This is an issue which has to be addressed at the states. I think it's pointless just discussing it as if it's just a union government issue.
No, so that is definitely another dimension of the problem. But as an example, look at the MHA circular on opening up some non-essential standalone businesses which came, over the weekend, and the kind of confusion it caused. At the end of the day, it is the states which have to implement it. But Nitin Pai, the reason I bring that up is because it's an example of how tough the path ahead seems to be. The center has to take a decision. The states have to implement. The states want to, some of them, for example, want to reopen liquor shops because they don't have any revenues. So, where really is the way out of this conundrum?
So, there.
This question.
Sorry, is that you're going to Mr. Pai?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. The first thing we've got to realize by now is that a national level policy on lockdown does not wash. It has to be a state level policy, and even among state, it has to be a locality based action. So as Dr. Virmani mentioned, we are going to be in this situation for the next 2 years. So we've got to learn how to carry on with our lives and our economy under the shadow of the pandemic. It's not going to be a lockdown versus non-lockdown issue. It's going to be various levels of risks in the shadow of the pandemic, and we've got to calibrate our economic activity and our livelihoods proportional to the level of risk. Now, the best institution or the best level of government you can do this at is probably the district at the Gram Panchayat or the municipal ward level. So we've got to move to that level of granularity. So where you can have a containment zone or a lockdown in a particular locality which is seeing an outbreak, there is a locality maybe 50 kilometers away which is non-contiguous, which should be allowed to proceed with its life and economic activity with safe precautions, masks, social distancing, etc. That, I think, is the simple formula of how we've got to go. The only national strategy is a distributed local level strategy. A national lockdown wherein you ban e-commerce in Bangalore because there are vested interests lobbying for small traders somewhere else just doesn't make sense, because the political economies are also localized. So you should be able to allow activities to take place in some parts of the country, whereas the same activities might not be justified in another part of the country. So this is the way we've got to go. And I think we have no real choice in this matter, because 1 month into the lockdown, we've already seen 140 million people being unemployed, losing their jobs in just 2 months. We can't afford a national strategy where millions of people, their lives and livelihoods are at risk because of an outbreak which might not even be happening in their neighborhood.
Just to follow up on that, Mr. Pai, the kind of confusion or a bit of haphazardness in policy is also concerning. You talked about e-commerce. Now, initially, there was a situation where you were allowing e-commerce to deliver non-essential goods. And then, the traders said, what about us? We're the ones who kept our kirana dukans open. So where's the level playing field? Fair enough, you removed that. Now you have a situation where you could allow non-essential, standalone shops to open, but not on e-commerce. There seems to be so much political pressure and pulls which may not need to be a priority right now in the face of the lockdown.
Yeah, exactly. Resuming economic activity does not mean going in for a command economy, right? A bunch of bureaucrats sitting in New Delhi or the state capitals are not the right kind of people to decide what is essential and what's not. I mean, if you're caught in a lockdown without the mobile phone charger or your laptop charger, you're short of an essential commodity, right? And no laptop charger is considered an essential commodity at this time. So it's not for a bureaucrat or a government to make that decision, especially at a national level, on what is essential, what is not, right? I think that decision has to be left to the states. It properly belongs to the level of the states. And the states, in turn, must delegate it to the level of districts or the Zilla Panchayat or the Panchayat or the municipality or the ward concerned. And that is the only way we can make sense out of this. Every other thing leads us into absurd situations where something is considered essential, something is not. Some shops are open, some shops are closed. Shops which are single-owned are allowed to open at 50% of their workforce. Some other kind of shop is not. It's just a hodgepodge of regulations which very few people can make sense of, 1 or 2 days later.
Yeah. The other point I want to highlight and focus on, and Mr. Sinha, let me come to you on this, is the point about unemployment. Now, there is some sort of an appeal which has gone from the government to big corporations at least, saying that don't sack people, don't cut pay. Some have maybe postponed the decision, others have gone ahead. In smaller and medium businesses, it's a free-for-all depending on what their situation is. How bad do you see this becoming? The situation about job losses, about industry closing down. There is data today to suggest that 90% of SMEs have 1 month of cash left.
Well, the situation can get pretty bad, and it's heading in that direction right now. And the reason I say that is because if you're a small business and you have zero sales, uh, even if you have some other kind of business where you have sales but no money coming in because nobody's paying you for, for your product or your service, um, and you have on the other hand bills to be met, whether it's payroll, whether it's debt servicing, whether it's some other operating expenditure like rental payments or what have you, then there's only so long that you can survive. Whether you're a small business or a big business does not even matter actually at some level. If you're a small business, you have fewer employees. If you're a bigger business, you have more employees. But the reality is that, so I think what will happen is that people will try not to sack people as best as they can help it, because nobody wants to get a bad reputation in these times. Everybody wants to do the right thing. Nobody wants to just for the heck of it, take decisions where you put other people into an even more difficult space. But having said that, the reality is if you don't have money in your pocket, then even if you want to pay, you will not be in a position to do so. So therefore, my feeling is that we have pushed the envelope very hard over the last 40 days. And, some might argue, and I would as well, by the way, that this was necessary, that at least the first lockdown was absolutely important. Um, and the second lockdown was just in good measure also to see whether, in fact, we could get the number of cases to actually start trending down. That hasn't happened, even though we've got flat number of cases coming up every day now. It's not gone down, unfortunately. And so that's in some ways been both a success and a failure of the whole lockdown effort. We fired our best bullet, and that bullet has not led to a situation where we're actually having a reduction in the number of cases. So now we have to revisit our strategy. And if that means this kind of intermittent lockdown type situation carrying on, so be it. But the issue is that because of that stress that we've already done in the economy, businesses are really suffering. And it is now getting to the point where people, even despite their best intentions, will have to start letting people go. And the economic malaise then is just going to get worse, because that is going to then impact consumer demand. You can already see the stress building up in the financial markets. And even though the RBI has tried to come in and step in and try to help out, banks are just taking the liquidity and sitting on it. They're not lending it to NBFCs. They're not lending it to mutual funds now, most likely as well. They're certainly not lending it to businesses. And so therefore, that liquidity is just coming in there and sitting down. And it's not going anywhere because of massive risk aversion that is building up. And I think as long as this thing carries on, that risk aversion is just going to keep increasing and increasing. And the more businesses start going under, the more that risk aversion is going to keep increasing, and the less liquidity there will be in the system. So we're actually heading for a bit of a vicious cycle here, where it's just going to keep feeding onto itself and become worse. So I think we have to find a way of stopping that. As I said, one is a fiscal stimulus. Whether the government chooses to do it or not, I can't say. But that could be one way of getting around it. The second is start lifting the lockdown in some reasonable manner, so that businesses can start getting up and running in different parts of India. Start letting construction happen. Start letting labor move around again, so that at least that can start beginning. That can start happening as well. So there are quite a few steps that still can be taken right now, and that do need to be taken to start getting businesses to start coming back. Otherwise, the economic malaise, job losses will just keep increasing, unfortunately.
Dr. Virmani, why do you think the delay, in your view, on the financial package? Is it because of a dearth of funds, or there are too many various demands? Every sector basically is demanding some kind of help right now. What do you think is the issue in formulating this kind of a package?
See, there are a number of issues which have come up, which I want to comment briefly on. See, you have to be very careful about this centralization, decentralization issue. And I'll just give you an example of somebody has studied New York versus Washington State, where San Francisco is, where the pandemic came early. And one of the important things they find is that there has to be integrated message. So though I agree with Dr. Pai that you have to give a lot of scope for decentralized action, there has to be an overriding approach which lays out the broad parameters within which each acts. Otherwise, the messages can get very confused. So I'm not disagreeing with Nitin here, but you have to be careful, because if you start sending wrong messages, then it doesn't work, because people just do whatever they feel like, or they are totally confused. And we have this now a case study, as I mentioned, between New York and Washington. So that's the first point. The second point to remember is there are basically three phases. And I think, well, I have been conveying on various ways, and I hope that the government has got it, but not everybody outside has got it. The three phases are: when you're in a lockdown, you have to remember there is no demand and supply. There is demand and supply for essential commodities. There is none for the rest of the economy. There's neither demand nor supply. And any government expenditure or anything you inject to the economy has no effect in general. Of course, you have survival issues where if people don't have enough to buy food or to charge their cell phone. By the way, in our division of the economy, we define cell phones, internet access, and media as essential in the modern world, by the way. So, finally, when you're talking about this phase, the key problem here is legal asymmetry. You cannot have state and union governments telling people that they've got to pay out all the stuff, they have to have all the labor, but you can't produce and sell. I mean, that is stupid. That means you'll have a disaster where there'll be no employment even after the crisis is over, because you'll kill all these industries. Now, once you're through this lockdown phase, yes, the key issue is the survival of companies. And in my view, nobody in the world has enough money, given the size and uncertainty of the pandemic, to just say we'll spend whatever, just announce that we'll spend 20%, 30%. That will not work in India, at least I can 100% sure. You have to focus on where it is needed, build up the program from the ground up and say, okay, these are the things which we have to ensure they survive, whether it's airlines, the real estate sector, which was already in trouble before, autos, whatever, and say, okay, we will start with this, and then maybe if there are gray areas, we'll go on and provide more to those. But I agree that there seems to be a little bit of a delay, because some of these things have to be announced in advance. You can't do it at the last moment, because there are always administrative issues to be worked through.
All right, I don't know if it's a little bit of a delay or a big delay, or what will eventually come, how much will it help. The fact is that we have to live with coronavirus for some time now. The impact is going to be there in our lives. Mr. Pai, in your view, what should be the priority to figure out, a post 3rd May kind of scenario? Right now, for some states, it may just be convenient to, exceed the lockdown. For state governments, for administrations also, it's easier to handle things when everyone is shut in their homes. So that may be the first choice for policymakers in some cases. But what really needs to be the top priority for a graded exit out of this?
See, let me just put two things out first. I think in terms of bringing relief to our people who are affected, I don't think we can rely on monetary policy or fiscal policy at all. We need to find a way to do direct transfers of cash to people who are needy, people who are vulnerable. And this can be direct person-to-person transfer. There's nothing which prevents me today from contributing using UPI to people who might need it. So I think one of the first things the union government has to do is to make these things tax deductible, so that individuals can give money to other individuals and help them out during the time of this crisis. And this is also the most effective way, most efficient way we can actually transfer money without actually routing it through a government fund. I think second, you asked me about the priority. I think there are two dimensions here. What is an economic multiplier and what is the vulnerability of the people at risk? I think we have got to maximize on both these dimensions. Is the particular sector, opening up a particular sector, going to create great economic multipliers, higher economic multipliers? And is opening up of a particular sector going to help people whose lives are most vulnerable? Construction, for example, employs a large number of people on a daily wage kind of a basis. And opening that up, because it also is capital investment in buildings and plant, getting such activities up and running first would be the priority. Now, again, from an outbreak point of view, these present unusual kind of risks, because how are you going to ensure social distancing? Yes. But I think these are human problems, and human ingenuity has to find solutions to this. I think we are not in a position to say, this is difficult, so let's close it down. So manufacturing, for example, there are ways you can reduce the workload at shifts. You can reduce the number of people working on a particular production line. You can increase the number of shifts. And here's one interesting thing. Why don't we have the night economy, for example? If we can open up our shops 24 hours a day, we can reduce the load on them by ensuring that some people go and shop at night and not necessarily crowd in the same shops during the entire day. So there are multiple ways we can actually tackle this problem. I don't think it is as bad as people feel. It just needs us to have some clear thinking and understand what the priorities are. And these are definitely about saving the jobs from being permanently lost, saving livelihoods from being permanently affected, and getting the economy back in shape in some form or the other. One final point. I think in a situation like India's, the wage is the ultimate social security, and the cash is the ultimate economic stimulus. We've got to find people to start earning, find ways to get people to start earning their wages again, and to get the cash registers moving again. That's the way forward for us. I don't think we have the fiscal room to be able to pay people to stay at home even for weeks together.
No, and let people be productive. People want to be productive. Let them be productive. Let them go on their living and their daily bread. Let's find a way to make it happen. I want to thank all of you for joining us in the debate today. We'll have to wait and see what are the moves coming in from various state governments over the next 1 week or so. If we saw what happened last time, we'll probably see states talking about their own plans, their own kind of extensions possibly, and then perhaps a central government decision on the same. But it will all depend at the end of the day on a vaccine, which is why, as I thank my first set of guests and take a very short break, I want to tease a very important interview I'm doing on the other side with Azad Poonawala of the Serum Institute of India. How soon can we have a homegrown vaccine? And will that really be the change maker? Coming back soon.